evening. Welcome to the third webinar in the Spring 2026 series presented by Newton Conservators. My name is Beth Wilkinson, and I will be your moderator for this webinar. Barbara Bates is our technical director. As most of you know, Newton Conservators is an all-volunteer nonprofit established in 1961. We follow the belief of naturalist Aldo Leopold that when we see land as a community to which we belong, we may begin to use it with love and respect. We are extremely fortunate to have Elizabeth Barnes here to teach us about spotted lanternflies. Elizabeth is the Forest Pest Outreach Coordinator with the Massachusetts Department of Agricultural Resources and previously worked as the Exotic Forest Pest Educator at Purdue University. She received her doctorate in plant-insect interactions from the University of Denver, where she studied tent caterpillars and fall webworms. Welcome, Elizabeth. We're really excited.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here. Okay. So thank you so much for inviting me here to talk today about spotted lanternfly. To start out with, I think it's useful to go over some kind of general information about what invasive species actually are and why we care about them before diving into spotted lanternfly specifically. So a few definitions. A native species is any sort of organism that either occurs or has occurred naturally in an area. And that can be something like sugar maples for New England, or it can include things like passenger pigeons, which are no longer around in New England. Now, a non-native species is any sort of organism that's been moved from one area to another area, typically by people, and is able to establish itself out in the wild. An example of this would be the apple tree, which you see in the top photo there. They're not originally from North America, but you can certainly find them growing out in the woods in places where they weren't originally planted. But usually you only find one or two unless you've, stumbled across an old abandoned orchard. So they're out in the woods, but they're not really outcompeting native plants typically. Now, an invasive species is a specific type of non-native species. It's, again, moved from one area to another area by people, is able to establish in the wild, and causes harm to people and or the ecosystem. So this harm aspect is really the key part of what defines an invasive species. An example of this is the bottom photo I have, which, yes, it's a small version of the plant, but I couldn't resist because I think it just took me by surprise when I saw it. So this is a tree of heaven. Tree of heaven is not originally from North America, but is definitely established out in the wild. They will grow in dense patches where they outcompete other plants that are there. When those native plants aren't there, there's not food for insects because most insects that are native to North America can't eat tree of heaven. And when those insects aren't around, the things that eat insects have less food, and you get these ripple effects through the food web. In addition to that, tree of heaven can do things like, well, this. They can grow into storm drains. They can have their roots grow into pipes in the foundations of buildings, and they can cause cracks in them and damage that way. So definitely harmful to people and definitely harmful to the ecosystem. What do we do about invasive species? Well, there are sort of typically a series of stages for dealing with these organisms. The first one is just trying to prevent the introduction to begin with. And there are both international agreements between countries to try and limit the spread of invasive species. If there's a particular pathway, for example, the pallet wood in shipping containers, often we've now learned is a potential pathway for wood-boring insects. So now there are all sorts of rules about what needs to be done to pallet wood to reduce the risk of invasive species spreading that way. And then there's also often inspections at the areas of entry for potential areas where invasive species might be brought in. Now, sometimes things aren't stopped through that means. So what do we do once it's here? Well, if we're able to catch it early enough, sometimes they can be eradicated. There are some species that this can that we have really effective methods for this, but there are other species where, whether because of how late we caught it or the biology of this species, we just aren't able to eradicate it. And when I say we, I mean the broader invasive species community. This is not all just Massachusetts. Then if it's not able to be eradicated and it's still spreading, there's usually an effort made to slow down the spread of that organism. This can be really important for a number of reasons. First, because a lot of times invasive species aren't very well known in their host range. Many times they're organisms that are only there in small numbers. They're not really causing issues. And so they haven't really been well studied. Invasive species also often behave very differently in their introduced range than their native range, and even between introduced ranges. And so there's a lot of research that needs to be done to learn about the impact that these species are even going to have. It can also give time for people to develop better management strategies, and for people who know that it might impact them, but it's not quite there yet, to start to prepare and think about what they're going to do once it reaches them. And then finally, once it's more widespread, I mean, yes, of course, we would still like to try and get rid of it if we can, but that's not always possible. So once it's more widespread, the hope is that we'll have found some ways to reduce the impact. And this can be in more active ways. That could include, for something that's affecting trees, that might include, say, insecticidal treatments, that might include silvicultural options that help the health of the tree to make it less likely that it will be, say, killed by the invasive species. But there are also more sort of passive options that the goal will be to have developed as well. Again, for invasive insects that are affecting trees, there's a couple ways we look to do this. So first, is there any sign of resistance in the plants that they affect? And if there is, there may be an effort to try to develop a cultivar of that plant that is resistant to the invasive species and therefore can kind of defend itself against it, and then eventually, reintroduce that into the wild, use it as for street plantings, things like that. And there's actually a effort going on right now from the U.S. Forest Service to do this with emerald ash borer that's looking extremely promising. Then on the flip side of things, people will look for natural enemies that might help knock down the number of those species. That might be things that are in the area that it's introduced that are already native there. But oftentimes that's looking at where that insect originally came from and trying to see if there are any highly specialized natural enemies that will only go after that insect and nothing else. And this can also be a really effective option for knocking down numbers. Now, neither of these will completely get rid of the invasive species, but the hope is that it will essentially restore some of the checks and balances that that organism would have in its native range. Because these species are not inherently bad. They are not inherently destructive. They are just taken out of that context where they have co-involved with the other organisms in that environment, where there are things that, keep it at kind of low levels. Maybe there's that occasional outbreak, but for most parts at low levels, and then putting it in a spot where it can spread. So the goal with these two things is to restore that ecosystem balance so that, maybe we'll run into them occasionally out in the woods, but for the most part, they're at just like any other bug out there. Okay, now let's hop into spotted lanternfly, the insect that you're all here for. Now, give you a broad overview. Spotted lanternfly is an invasive sap-sucking insect. They are hemipteran, so they're more closely related to things like cicadas or plant hoppers than the butterflies that they look like. They're not a major pest in their native range, although they do have the occasional outbreak there as well. And they are also invasive in Korea, where they were found in around 2006, in Japan, where they were found in around 2009. And a lot of the initial information we were getting about them was coming from the experiences of those two countries, some of which turned out to be applicable here, and some of which seems to be different between those in invaded areas. They were accidentally introduced into the US in Pennsylvania on some imported stone in around 2014, and they have unfortunately been spreading since then. Now, I do want to include just a quick caveat before we continue on. There is a lot we still need to learn about spotted lanternfly, and people are constantly coming out with new research about them. We're constantly figuring out new things about them. And so I'm going to give you the most up-to-date information we have right now, but I encourage you, if you ever have to deal with them directly in the future, to find out what the latest information is. You can, check our website, you can reach out directly to us, you can check other expert websites like UMass Extension or Penn State Extension is also really good for that. But just, find out what the latest recommendations are. Where are these things at the moment? So this map shows the national distribution of spotted lanternfly in terms of at the county level. The map is a little bit out of date. It's from July 2025. There have been some, they're working on getting it updated, but they're still trying to figure some things out on the back end, so it's not quite there yet. But I think it still gives you a good idea of where we are seeing these organisms. You can see there's a lot of counties in Pennsylvania and kind of the surrounding area with spotted lanternfly. And then it goes up into Massachusetts, unfortunately, where we are, and then out towards the Midwest a little bit, down south as well. And then there are a few scattered counties in the Midwest and in the South where they found spotted lanternfly. These insects are very, very good hitchhikers. We'll talk a little bit later about some of the ways that they can hitchhike on things. And they are unfortunately very easily spread around. Okay, so zooming in on Massachusetts, I thought it would be useful to give you a bit of a timeline for how they have spread over the years in the state and where they have shown up over the years in the state. So this map is from August 2022. You can see there are 3 different municipalities colored in orange there. Go to October 2023, so the next year, there's a few more. October 2024, there's even more areas with them. September 2025, quite a few more municipalities. And then that brings us to March 2026. And I will say not a ton were added after December 2025. So really these 2 maps between September and March, it's quite a big number of municipalities that were added to that list. Now, most of these places only have a small population of spotted lanternfly. There are some exceptions, but most of them, it's not like the entire municipality has spotted lanternfly. It's just a small area. However, unfortunately, once spotted lanternfly does get into an area, it is there to stay. Nobody's had any luck completely getting rid of them in other places. And so it's more about how do we manage them? How do we slow down their spread to other areas that don't have them yet, or, other parts of the municipality as well. Now, in terms of on the landscape, where do we tend to find them? They are an edge species. What that means is they tend to like to hang out in areas between open space and the woods. So that could be something like the edge of a parking lot. That might be on street trees or in people's yards. That might be like in that bottom left. Yes, okay, this is my left. That bottom left photo where it's a small patch of woods that's bracketed on either side by open areas, or that could be in somewhere like parks where you're finding them. Now, of course, that said, they like to surprise us. They can move around quite a bit, and we do encounter them in random places, like in the middle of the woods or in the middle of a golf course or a field. But it tends to only be, one or two, a few in those areas, and the highest concentration does tend to be in those edge areas. Next, we're going to go over the life cycle of spotted lanternfly and how to identify them, because they do look very different over the course of the year. When they first hatch out, which is around now, we actually got our first report of hatch just last Friday. So they are starting to hatch in Massachusetts, although in most places they're still egg masses. In those early stages, which last from around May through July, they are black with white spots on them, and they are very, very, very small. You can see they've got one by my thumb in the photo, and that yellow arrow is pointing to one at the tip of my hand. So they are itty bitty little insects. In around July, they reach their fourth instar, which is the fourth developmental stage. And they are now this bright red color. They've got white spots on them and black patches as well. Now, here are some examples of them out in the wild. You can see a lot of times they tend to cluster on the underside of leaves. They'll also be on the stems of plants. And if you are ever trying to take a picture of them, they like to do the same thing as like a squirrel does when it sees you and it's on a tree trunk, and it will try to go on the opposite side from you. The spotted lanternfly will do the same thing. So I worked very hard to get that bottom photo on that rose. And the photo in the top corner is a grapevine with, I promise there is a spotted lanternfly visible on it, but I'm only a few feet away from it, but I wanted to show you how well they kind of just disappear into the background at this stage when you're just kind of walking around and looking at them. Okay, the adults. Now, this is a life stage that most people start to notice. It is the most recognizable one. This lasts in Massachusetts from around July into December. That could be a little earlier in some years. Really, it's July until the first hard frost of the year, or if it's, sometimes the first couple hard frosts. They are a gray-brown color with spotted wings, and those bright colors you may have seen in pictures are hidden when they're at rest. The only bit of brightness that's visible is they have these two little dots under their eyes. They almost look like some animated characters have like these spots of blush right under their eyes. It kind of reminds me of that. Those are actually the bases of their antennas. And if you ever see one in person, look for there's like a tiny thin little, it almost looks like a hair coming out of it. That's their antenna. When they have their wings open, you can see those bright, flashy colors. They have this red stripe with black spots in it, a white swoosh, and then they're black at the end. And when they are getting ready to lay eggs, the female's abdomens will swell way up and they turn this bright, vivid yellow. Again, here are some examples of them out in the environment. I think it shows really nicely how when you've got them on like a green background, they really stand out. But when you've only got, say, one, like the top right photo here, and they're on a branch or a tree trunk, sometimes it's hard to spot them. They blend in surprisingly well when there's not like a huge mass of them. Now, the egg masses. These are very, very hard to see. Each egg mass is about 1.5 inches long and contains between 30 to 50 eggs. So one egg mass a couple egg masses, you can imagine those accidentally getting brought to a new area, hatching out. That's, 50 to 100 little lanternfly in that new area with just 2 egg masses. They are a kind of grayish brown color and they're covered in this putty-like coating. Sometimes they don't finish covering it, so you might see some of them are exposed. Sometimes they have a little zigzag at the end, but overall, you're most likely to see kind of those classic middle pictures where it's that gray-brown color covered in, it looks like putty almost. And unfortunately, they will lay these on pretty much anything outside. So trees, firewood, fence posts, ladders, buildings. And when they have the opportunity, they will try to kind of tuck them into things and hide them. So there's one behind those vines in that top photo on the right. And then there's one tucked into, actually several tucked into a crack in a tree trunk on that bottom photo. And here's even more things. So outdoor furniture, camping equipment, vehicles, patio furniture, cinder blocks, all sorts of different things. The weirdest one that I have heard about is someone found one on a light bulb, which presumably it's going to get fried when you turn it on, but it still shows you the sheer variety of places these insects are willing to lay their egg masses. And I have a little game here. I'll try and keep it short and sweet so we can get on to some of the other sections and their impact. But in all of these photos, there's at least one spotted lanternfly egg mass, sometimes more. So I'll give you a second to look at them, see if you can spot them, and then I'll show you where they are. All right, just give you another second. And here you go. Okay, so in the top photos, I have it circled in the red dotted line. And then in the bottom photos, I have some close-ups I took of where they actually are. The first photo on the tree is probably the easiest one to spot. It does look like some of those other little splotches on that bark, but it's a little more obvious. It's right out there. The middle one was in a desk we found abandoned in the woods, and we saw a couple that were visible on the outside. And then the person I was in pointed out, hey, we should open this thing up and see if there's any more inside. And we found, gosh, I can't remember if it was 12 or 16, but somewhere in there, we found even more spotted lanternfly egg masses hidden in the desk, which we never would have even noticed if we hadn't pulled it open. And then finally, that rock photo, I think it shows really nicely how much these egg masses can look like lichen. And in terms of the egg masses, I would say the most common lookalikes that we see people thinking are spotted lanternfly egg masses would be fungus and lichen on trees. So they look very, very similar. Now we're going to get into the biology of this insect and some of its impacts. Now, spotted lanternfly have an extremely wide number of different species of plants that they will eat. They will feed on everything from something as small as basil, other garden plants, all the way up to full-grown trees like maple trees. However, they do have preferences, and those preferences shift over the course of the summer. So early in the year, they tend to prefer smaller plants like roses, perennials. We also have seen them a lot in Massachusetts on bittersweet and poison ivy. And then later in the year, they switch on to those larger plants like birches, willows, maples, and things like that. However, the two plants that they like the most, and you can find them on at any point during the year, are grape, both wild and cultivated, and tree of heaven. Those two are their absolute favorites. The way that they feed is using this straw-like mouth part. They basically stick it into the bark of the plant, kind of like a plant mosquito, and then they drink the sap out of the plant. And what this means is the actual direct damage from the feeding is really not usually visible to the human eye. It's just this tiny, tiny, tiny little hole that you usually can't see even if you know where they were feeding. Occasionally, we do see some staining around that feeding location, but for the most part, you're not going to notice it. And this is really important because sometimes there will be other things attacking the same tree as a spotted lanternfly is feeding on. And so sometimes people will see like their tree has been defoliated or their plant has a bunch of holes chewed in the leaves or like half the leaves are missing, or there are tunnels under the barks. And none of those are spotted lanternfly. They are physically incapable of causing that type of damage just because their mouths can't bite. They just have that little straw for a mouth. And so what that means is that there's something else affecting that plant in addition to the spotted lanternfly. So if someone wants to protect that plant, it's important to figure out what that other thing is so that they can, help it appropriately. The impact of spotted lanternfly on the plant itself depends on a whole different range of things, but these three things seem to be the most important. So first off, how many spotted lanternfly are actually feeding on that plant? If there's only a couple, usually not a big deal. If there's, a couple hundred, that can be more of an issue, and that does happen. What type of plant is it? So some plants seem to be more susceptible to heavy spotted lanternfly feeding than others. And then finally, how healthy is the plant? With this, if the plant is healthy going into things, it's more likely to be able to tolerate the lanternfly feeding than if it was already sickly to begin with. Now, some good news. There's, not often a lot of good news I can tell people when talking about invasive species, but we have a little bit of it. For most of those 100 different plants that I mentioned earlier, the impact is usually relatively minor. They might stress the plant a bit with heavy feeding, but the plants seem to usually bounce back from it. For example, there are people who have anecdotally, and I do want to emphasize this is anecdotally, there's not studies that I'm aware of on it yet, but anecdotally, people have said with some of their garden plants, they wilted. Well, there was that heavy feeding, but when the lanternfly moved on or when they got them off of their plants, they perked right back up and were fine for the rest of the summer. However, there is some concern in the long term about what this will mean when you combine it with something like disease, drought, heavy construction, other insect feeding, many years of feeding. And so that's an area of ongoing research right now. So what I would say is kind of put a mental pin in that. It's something that's being looked into, but we don't know what those long-term impacts might be yet. So check back in later for that. Now, exceptions to this are tree of heaven, which is, as we've talked about, also invasive. So, oh well. Black walnut saplings, occasionally some other types of saplings, and grape are all much more seriously affected by spotted lanternfly feeding. You can see things like the weeping of sap from the trees. That first photo, all of that dark area is actually sap. That's not water dripping down the tree. The buildup of slime flux at the base of the tree, which is this frothy, foamy mess. It's really gross, smells really bad. If it's on a tree of heaven, it's even worse because, as some of you may know, tree of heaven normally smells like rancid peanut butter is the best way I've heard it described. And so when you take that rancid peanut butter smell and you ferment it, it's an even worse smell. It can also cause early yellowing of the leaves, dieback of branches, and even complete death of the plant. And I do want to mention grapes in particular because they have been the hardest hit. They can kill grapes in as little as a single season and often leave them with a bad taste when there's heavy feeding, even if they survive. You can see those lanternfly just absolutely covering the vine in the top photo. Do note there that they are not feeding on the grapes themselves. They are feeding on the vine. They can reduce photosynthesis, sap flow, storage of carbohydrates and nitrogen, and just generally make them more susceptible to stress over the winter. And I did also just really quickly want to mention some of the things grapes are important for. I think some of the cultivated grape benefits are easy to think of. So table grapes, wine, grape juice, grape jelly. But the wild grapes are also important. They can do things like help stabilize banks along streams and rivers. This is an incredibly small thing, but I at least personally love it when I'm going for a walk and I go by an area with some grapes, wild grapes growing, and you just get that wonderful, pleasant smell. And so I include this because I think it's useful to think about both the large scale impacts of invasive species and also the very, very small scale ones like that. Animals can also be impacted by them. So birds and mammals will eat the grapes. They also wild grapes can provide great nesting sites for birds. And pollinators will visit grapevines, as well as there being many types of insects that either rely entirely on grapes for their host plants or are, only are able to feed on grapes and a few other things. Now, there are some very important secondary impacts from spotted lanternfly. First off is the honeydew that they produce. So honeydew is a lovely word for insect excrement. If you've ever had an aphid outbreak or a mealybug outbreak or something like that on your plants, and you see there's that like sticky liquid underneath them, that's honeydew. So imagine that, but scale them up to, about the size of the end of your thumb, but keep the same number of insects, and you can imagine what mess it starts to make. It can also attract insects like bees and wasps and ants to an area. Which if you're trying to spend some time in your backyard or in a park, you don't really want, yellow jackets buzzing all around you. Now, here is an early season example of some of that honeydew. It does get much more extensive, but I like to include this photo because you can actually see those little dots. And they're not just under the tree itself. They can actually be in kind of a bit of a circle around the tree, because when the spotted lanternfly feed, they're not just dropping the honeydew straight down. It's actually like shooting out in these little spurts. Now, I mentioned bees like the honeydew. So the bees collect the honeydew, and it actually affects the flavor of their honey. The peak collection tends to be in August, September, and October. This is when the lanternfly are the largest, and so they're producing the most honeydew, and also when they're all clustered together, so it's easier for the bees to collect. And it's also when a lot of the other resources the bees might be collecting from go away. Good news is bees seem to do fine with it. Based on what research has been done so far, they haven't seen an issue, so hopefully it stays that way. But it does, the honey is very distinctive and very different. You can see 2 jars of honey in my picture on the side there. The first is just some regular old Massachusetts honey. I bought it at the Big E. It's sort of the classic, typical Massachusetts honey that you would see. And then the other jar is some of the spotted lanternfly honey. And you can see it's a lot darker. It has kind of a smoky, molassesy smell to it. The flavor will depend on the ratio of honeydew to other things that they're collecting. And then it'll also depend on the plants the spotted lanternfly are feeding on. With some of you may have gotten to try some honey that's made from different specific flowers before. And what you will often find there is you get these very distinctive flavors depending on where the bees are collecting from. So the flavor goes from the flower to the bee to the honey. And in this case, the flavor is going from the plant sap to the spotted lanternfly, out is the honeydew, to the bee, to the honey, and then to your taste buds. The flavor is, again, kind of smoky. It's less sweet. I would say there's a bit of a sour flavor to it as well. It's very strong and distinctive. I have a couple jars of it. I like to do things like, I'll put it in yogurt. I've heard of people baking with it. I definitely wouldn't want to use it with something where I want the other flavors of what I'm eating to stand out more. Like, I don't know that I'd put it in tea personally. But there are definitely uses for it. Just like I have some chestnut honey, and there's like same deal where I don't want it to overpower what I'm eating, but when it's the star of the show, I enjoy it that way. That said, I have an extra jar of it because my boss got a jar of it and she tried it and she hated it so much. She was like, "Here, take this. I don't want it even in my house. Get it out of here." She really didn't like it. So it's pretty divisive in terms of flavor. Now, the honeydew can also grow sooty mold. And this can be a problem for whatever it's gotten on. If it's in the forest, it's a little hard to see here. So here are some closer examples of leaves with that sooty mold on it. It can make it difficult for the plants to photosynthesize because the sunlight isn't reaching those leaves in the same way, because it's blocked on the surface by the sooty mold. If it gets on people's property, it can also be a big problem. In this case, these stairs, the top 2 stairs, have not been washed. The bottom stair has been power washed. This person had to repeatedly power wash their steps over the course of the summer because it kept getting honeydew on it over and over and over again. And that sooty mold, it can stain things sometimes. Sometimes it can be even a little bit slippery. It's definitely sticky. One of my colleagues was out working on spotted lanternfly and got it on his glasses and had a really hard time managing to wash it off because it was stuck on really well without damaging his glasses themselves. So it's very, very difficult to clean. And, if that's in your yard, you can imagine if you're trying to sit in your yard enjoying a nice, lovely day outside, and all of a sudden you've got this like sticky stuff all over you. If it is on a street tree, then if it's over where people are parking their cars, that can be an issue. If it's over a bench, say in a park or near a bus stop, then suddenly that bench is really sticky and unpleasant. Also, in the areas that have had it longer, there have been reports from businesses that have, for example, patio seating or venues like wedding venues that are outdoors, from orchards where people do pick your own orchards, where the people get really annoyed by these insects flying all over the place, landing on them. I don't want to say they're not smart because they were very well adapted to where they were. And then all of a sudden they have people around them. So basically they're not good at distinguishing between what's a tree and what's just a tall thing. So if there's a person standing there, it thinks, haha, a tree, and they will land on us. Like this poor guy here. If it's, a telephone pole, I won't get into it because I don't have time, but there's a whole interesting study with telephone poles where they basically get stuck in a loop. If it's on, an umbrella, at a table, they'll land on that. So overall, I think it's really important with this insect to not just think about the direct health impacts on the plants, but also think about the quality of life issues for people who are trying to spend time outside, or people who have businesses where they're trying to encourage people to spend time outside. Because, as you can see in that last photo, and I've showed a couple other similar photos, that level of lanternfly is not unusual once the population builds up. And what other states have seen that have had it longer than us is oftentimes there's a low level of them for the first couple of years, and then there's this spike, and it feels like they're just everywhere. So this can be a fairly big issue that's worth thinking about before they build up to that level. So what can you do? Well, the first thing is, as we talked about, try to slow down their spread. Unfortunately, these guys are very good at hitching rides to different areas. Here are just a few examples of ways they can do that. They can, lay eggs on, as I mentioned, furniture, nursery stock. Firewood is a big way, not just spotted lanternfly, but a whole long list of other invasive species can be spread around. If you're using firewood, we always encourage people to get it as close to where you're going to burn it as possible. There's a whole Don't Move Firewood program that if you haven't seen before, it's worth checking out. They've got a lot of really great resources, both for finding firewood and also for understanding firewood laws in different states. They can also be spread around on vehicles. There was actually a study done where they put lanternflies in wind tunnels with vehicles, and they found that even at highway speeds, they've got these strong, grippy little legs where they can hold on to vehicles even at those high speeds. You are traveling through or live in an area with lanternfly, it can be really, really helpful to check anything you've had outside for the lanternfly, and also importantly for their egg masses. Think about things like, equipment, whether that's camping equipment or yard equipment, yourself. They can land on you, and sometimes you don't notice. When they do crawl on your skin, there is like a kind of a little bit of a prickly feeling. They've got little tiny hooks on their feet that are like most insect or many insects anyway. So sometimes you'll feel it when they're crawling on you, but if they're on your shirt, you're not necessarily going to notice. Check any material you've received from out of state, just in case anything that hitchhiked that way or that has come from an area with spotted lanternfly. For vehicles, check the tires, the wheel wells. Wheel wells in particular around that like mid-September to all the way through until the next spring are very important to check because they love laying their egg masses in wheel wells, and it just looks like a splotch of mud. What I recommend people doing, particularly during that egg laying time period and that overwintering time period, is if you see something that looks like a little 1.5-inch splotch of mud in your wheel well or really anywhere on your car, take something, gently scrape it off. We have, I don't know if this will show up on camera or not, but we have these scraper and ID cards that we made. You can use them. You just crush the egg mass and then scrape it off. If you don't want to crush the egg mass, because they are a little gooey, so some people don't want to, you can also get a Ziploc bag or a little container and fill it with either rubbing alcohol or hand sanitizer and just scrape the eggs right into it, and that'll kill them as well. You can also use like a credit card, although you have to not mind getting it a little gooey, but an ice scraper or a paint scraper, anything like that. Just be careful with all of those if it's on your car, not to damage it. But if you scrape that off your car and it is a lanternfly egg mass, that's 30 to 50 lanternflies you're preventing from hatching out in a new area. If it was mud, your car is cleaner. Excellent. So it's, win-win situation other than the little bit of time it takes to do it. Other places to check are in the trunk. Sometimes they fly in, hitch a ride that way. Windshields, particularly at the base of the windshield wipers, they like to hang out there. And any trailers or truck beds or anything like that that might have been open, they can also hitch a ride there. The QR code in the corner would take you to our YouTube channel, and this will also be sent out after the webinar today, but it has some short 3-minute videos that we put together, one of which goes over how to reduce the risk of spreading spotted lanternfly. We've got some other ones about management and things like that. We also have a short 30-second video about egg mass scraping, so you can see what that looks like in action. And also some of our longer webinars are on there about spotted lanternfly. Now, management challenges. So yes, here's another one of those pictures that shows the sheer density you can get of spotted lanternfly. If you are trying to manage spotted lanternfly, one of the big issues is the sheer high number of spotted lanternfly you're dealing with. And they are not just sticking to one tree, they are highly mobile. So they're flying around. They have powerful legs, so they're hopping around as well. They're moving between host plants, not just between those different life stages, but even within a life stage, they like to switch around between trees. So it's not like you can just focus on one particular plant. And because of all of this, they will reinvade areas. So even if you had somehow managed to get rid of all of the spotted lanternfly on this tree, you would still get more coming in over the course of the summer, which means that with a very few exceptions, a lot of the management options you have to do multiple times over the course of the summer in order to really get rid of spotted lanternfly, if that's your goal. We do have a management guide. There's a link at the bottom, QR code, and also that will be sent out in the email. But I just wanted to give you kind of a broad overview of some of the options. There are pros and cons to each of them that I'm not going to get into too much detail right now. There's things like egg mass scraping, insecticides, horticultural oil for the egg masses. If you use either of those two, please remember the label is the law. Always follow the label when we're using things like that. Netting, if you've got a small number of plants you're trying to protect. Traps, I've got an example of a circle trap and a sticky band here. I did want to take a minute to mention, if you're using sticky bands for spotted lanternfly or anything else, make sure you look into how to create a barrier to reduce the bycatch on those sticky bands. There have been some pretty sad stories coming out of other states in the last couple of years where people have used sticky bands for lanternflies, and other animals have gotten caught in it, things like birds and bats and frogs, squirrels, even butterflies. Basically things that might see the lanternfly and go in to snag it, to eat it, and then they get stuck, or things that are just also going up and down that tree and get stuck because they don't realize what the sticky band is until they're trapped. In some of these cases, wildlife rehabilitators were able to save the animals, but not all of them were so lucky. So I just, I mentioned that so that if that is the option you want to go with, look into, usually it's something as simple as, like, here we've got some mesh around the sticky band. So the lanternfly was still, when they're crawling up the tree, they'll get stuck, but it reduces the risk of other things getting trapped. And then lastly, vacuuming. This is, again, the management guide goes into more detail, basically using a shop vac to vacuum them up. With this one, from the people I've heard who have used it, usually they do it like once a day, once every other day, depending on the density of lanternflies, but it can be surprisingly effective if you don't have a lot of plants you're dealing with. Now, something that does often come up is, what about removing tree of heaven? Tree of heaven is also invasive. Spotted lanternfly like it. It seems like, hey, this is a 2-for-1. But I do want to caution people that removing tree of heaven will not stop spotted lanternfly. Spotted lanternfly don't need tree of heaven in order to survive and reproduce. One study found that they might lay slightly fewer eggs if they don't have access to tree of heaven, but they were still able to lay eggs. And it was only a very slight decrease. So they don't need tree of heaven to survive. And tree of heaven is also extremely difficult to control. If anyone's tried it before, if you cut it down and you do it wrong, and honestly, sometimes even if you do everything right, you end up with a whole thicket of them sprouting up. And so it really is quite a long and intensive process, and it's important to kind of know what you're getting into when you're doing that. Also, the sap can cause heart issues on some people. So it's important, if you're removing tree of heaven, to look into how to do it right and what, personal protective equipment you might need in order to do that. Now, that said, there are some instances where some people, for them, have felt like it made sense to remove the tree of heaven. So, for example, if you have tree of heaven, not really any other host plants nearby, and it's in an area where that honeydew is going to be a big problem, in that case, maybe removing tree of heaven might reduce the amount of honeydew underneath that tree. And so that might be helpful in that case. Again, if there's only really tree of heaven and not any other host plants, removing it might make it less likely that lanternfly is attracted to a specific spot. But in both of those cases, it really depends on what else is nearby. And that said, some of you might have seen some of the pictures from New York City where they're climbing up skyscrapers. So even it's not always a guarantee that removing that host plant is going to reduce the number of spotted lanternfly. Now, I do also want to say, if you want to remove tree of heaven because you want to control invasive plants, that is a totally different conversation. Invasive plants are issues in their own right. I talked about a little bit earlier some of the problems that tree of heaven cause, and I am all for people who are making that effort to get rid of invasive plants. So I just want to make sure that people, when they're going into it, they have the right expectations. So it's not going to necessarily, it's not going to fix the lanternfly problem, but it is also an invasive plant. So those are the considerations. Now, If there is still if tree of heaven around, if someone either doesn't want to remove it or can't remove it for whatever reason, there are some other things that it can be used for with spotted lanternfly. So the first that you might see mentioned that I sort of hesitate to bring up, but I feel like it shows up in enough places that it's worth talking about, is trap trees. This is a hotly debated topic in the world of spotted lanternfly management. The idea with a trap tree is that you remove most of the tree of heaven, you leave a few male plants, and then you treat those male plants with insecticides. And you're leaving the male plants so that they can't produce seeds. And then the hope is the spotted lanternfly will be drawn to those tree of heaven and will be killed, and that will hopefully reduce the numbers in the area. I have spoken to people who have done this and said it worked great. It was really successful. They were so happy they did it. I have talked to people who did this who said it did nothing. It was a complete waste of time and effort and money. So it seems to be situation dependent, but unfortunately right now we don't know what those situations are. My hope is that somebody will study this and help us better understand what we can do, but we're not there yet. So again, another one to put a pin in. Finally, you can use it for monitoring. So as I mentioned earlier, they like tree of heaven. Often they'll show up there first. So if you have one nearby and you don't have lanternfly yet, it can be useful to just kind of check it to see if they've shown up. And actually related to that, we have a project on iNaturalist, which is this cool biodiversity website that if you don't know about it, in the interest of time, I won't get into it. I'll talk here about it later if you have a question about it. But basically you can submit places where you've seen spotted lanternfly. It goes into a database that can be really useful for us when we're out following up on reports of spotted lanternfly, because that way, even if we don't find it in the place where the person saw it, we can say, hey, there's a tree of heaven nearby. Let's go check that and see if there's any on there too. Native predators are also something that often come up, and some native predators do eat them. I've got some great examples over there, but they don't eat enough. And in some cases, they seem to even start avoiding them. And so instead, what we'd really need are some highly specialized predators that are really focusing on spotted lanternfly. And the good news is the people at USDA, in collaboration with some universities here, as well as some of their counterparts in China, have found just such an insect. They went through a couple insects, and this one seems the most promising. It's Dryanus sinicus. It's from their native range in China, and it uses those huge front arms to grab spotted lanternflies in their early instars, lay their eggs on them, and then that eventually kills them. The hope with this is, as I mentioned earlier, it's unlikely to eradicate spotted lanternfly, but the hope is it can knock down the numbers to kind of manageable levels. However, there's still a lot they need to learn about it. They need to better understand how to rear it at large numbers. And also there's some really, really extensive work that they've done to look to make sure it's not going to attack things other than spotted lanternfly. It's a very, very long and rigorous process that they do before they even consider something for release. So it's not ready for it yet, although it sounds like they're getting close to starting that process to apply for review, which is really, really exciting. So this is like 5-10 years or so. I don't know the exact timeline, but this is something in the future that might be a possibility, that I just like to mention as a little bit of hope that maybe they'll be knocked down to more manageable numbers in the future. All right, to wrap up, resources. So if you spot a spotted lanternfly, snap a photo, note your location, send in a report to us. I do want to include the caveat that right now for reports, we are recording all the reports that come in, but we had to switch so that we're now not able to respond individually to all the reports. You will get, if you report it, you'll get an automatic reply. And if it's in a new town or in some other or new area, you'll get a second reply after that. But this last season, we received so many reports of spotted lanternfly that we could literally spend 24 hours a day, 7 days a week responding to the reports and still not be done. But as I said, we do record all those reports and we do appreciate them. Now, if you are not sure if you should send in a report or not, send it in anyway. We would always rather be safe than sorry. If you're not sure if it's spotted lanternfly or something else, send in that report. If you're not sure if it's the right area or not, send in that report. If it turns out to be another insect, all that happens is we still try to identify it for you and give you a cool fact about it if we can, because we are bug nerds and we enjoy sharing the joy of insects with other people when they are insects that are not causing issues like lanternfly. And then finally, if you see something weird, and by that I mean a bunch of an insect you've never seen before, a bunch of a specific type of plant dying for no clear reason, ask someone about it. That could be us. That could be someone like UMass Extension. That could be iNaturalist. But please just ask someone, because this is how we found out about a lot of species we had no idea were in Massachusetts or sometimes even in the country at all. And so it's very important to be curious and try and figure out what those things are so that we can catch these things early. We have resources available online. You can download them. If you live, work, do outreach or anything like that in Massachusetts, we're also happy to mail those to you for free. If you want to use them in a different state, we can also help to connect you with the people in those states that would have ones that are specific to your state. Finally, we have a newsletter, comes out once a month, 5 bullet points or less with links out to further information. It's all timely invasive insect and invasive plant information. You can sign up here. Again, I'll put that link in the email I'll send that link for the email that you get sent after this. And with that, I am happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Elizabeth. You gave us the most amazingly thorough overview, and it's really amazing that you welcome us to interact with you. That's just terrific. Thank you. And to show you that the listeners are not totally disgusted by what you've shown us about them, Alice says, I don't suppose they like to feed on knotweed. So wouldn't that be lovely?
Oh, I wish that would be nice if we could just get them just like the tree of heaven, the knotweed, the bittersweet. Like, we can work something out there maybe.
That would be a deal, wouldn't it?
Oh.
We got a couple questions about going back into your slides, so let's do that first.
Okay.
Could you please show us the map again of where they are in the eastern US? Probably the
Yes.
most recent one.
Let me pull this up again. All right. Okay, so this is where they've been found around the country, and this looks a little bit weird here because those areas were not filled in, and so since they're so close to Massachusetts, they do have spotted lanternfly there, and I wanted to make sure that people knew they were on the map. Yes, so this is the national map, and then did people want to see the Massachusetts one as well?
Sure, why not do that? I also did take screenshots of these, so I can pop them in the email that I send out tomorrow too.
Okay, so this is the latest Massachusetts map. So it's there's a big population. There are quite a bit around Springfield, Worcester, and then this kind of band that into Boston, near the Rhode Island border. A few up here in northeastern Massachusetts, a couple areas in the Berkshires, and then Fitchburg's hanging out there all on its lonesome, which, in this case is actually a good thing. We don't want it to spread anymore into the surrounding towns, but that's that's the one kind of up there by itself.
How quickly do they spread if they're going all on their own, and not being hauled by people? Or is it just so easy to be hauled by people that there really is no difference?
Um, yeah, so that's a great question. They can definitely move significantly further when they're moved by people. Um, for the distance they can travel on their own, this is another thing that there's a lot of argument about. But I've seen the estimates range from about a mile a year, and then at the high end, potentially up to 4 or 5 miles a year. So,
Wow. Wow.
um, but like I said, like there's argument about where it is in that range, but still nothing like they can move when they're being moved by people, where they can be moved hundreds of miles in a day or two.
Right. And and as you said, it takes a very small number to be moved to have them be established in a new area. So that really
Yes.
is okay.
Yeah, particularly that late season time period, where you've got either the females who are ready to lay eggs or those egg masses, which again actually can overwinter into the next year, so they can be moved anytime from around mid-September until like May, June-ish. Those are the times when you're potentially moving in a single little packet. You're potentially moving 30 to 50 lanternfly.
And what is the survival rate of those eggs? Is it pretty high?
Oh, like after hatch, I don't know. In terms of the numbers that hatch out of the eggs, from anecdotally, from what I have seen, it's usually most of them that are hatching out, but I will have to go and see if there's actually been like a study on that that's like pinpointed the number, because that's a good question.
Okay.
But it is they do have a pretty high survival rate.
And does the harshness of the winter make any difference? Like a really harsh winter won't kill them off?
No, unfortunately, the egg masses are pretty hardy. The tests that they've done with it required temperatures that are more similar to like northern Canada than anything we get in Massachusetts to kill
So
them
we
off.
have to move if that's how we're going to do it.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay. We have a question. Was it in basically October 2024 that they were first seen in Newton? Do you know that offhand?
I don't know that off the top of my head, but let me see if I can really quickly pull it up on our map. The map won't have the month, um, but I used to know, like back when we only had a few towns, I used to have it all on the top of my head and not so much anymore. Okay,
Don't worry. Go ahead.
so Newton, it was first found an actual population in 2024. So like I said, I don't know what point during the year that was, but yeah, that's one of the nice things about the map that I showed, which you can find yourself. We've got other species too, like pet zoo and beach leaf disease and things like that. You can click on the towns and it'll tell you when that infestation was first found.
Terrific. Thank you. So we have a question about where they are native specifically.
Yeah, they are native to East Asia, so sort of the southern part of China down into Vietnam. There are some reports of them potentially being as far over as India, but there's only a few reports of that. And again, this is an insect that in its native range isn't quite getting as much notice. I mean, I'm always amazed by how little we know about insects until they're right in our face. Even insects in like Massachusetts, there are some that we don't know what they're doing at some points of their life stage, just because no one's been able to figure it out yet. So anyway, that's that Southeast Asia is where they're primarily found, and there's like a basically the reason why they never previously made it up into Korea or Japan is there's a like basically a habitat barrier in the northern part of China that prevented them from getting up there. But then once people accidentally brought them, they did well.
Do we know what keeps them in check in their native habitat?
So it looks like parasitoids are a really big part of that. So things like the Dryanus sinicus that I showed you earlier, there again, small study as well as some anecdotal reports where there were places where the parasitoids numbers got knocked down, and then there was a spike in the lanternfly numbers, which is usually a pretty good indicator that that's playing a very important role in their population size. There's of course other things that affect it, like climate and other things like that. But those predators seem to be, based on what we know so far, those predators seem to be pretty important.
So we have a question saying that the bright red on the hind wing, is that an indication of toxicity? Does it scare off birds? Are they eaten by birds here?
I was hoping someone was going to ask about this. Okay,
We've got
so
great listeners here.
um, that is one of the things that people first thought when they saw them. They were like, there's got to be something going on here. And we don't know for sure yet, but there was a study that somebody did in Pennsylvania, which, if you're familiar with Emerald Ash Borer University, which is another webinar program, and I can share the link to it, they actually had the person on going through all of her research recently. Basically, it seems like it might depend on what they're feeding on, because in some instances where they were feeding, it seems like the ones that were feeding more on Tree of Heaven, the birds would like eat them and then be like, no, I don't want anything to do with this anymore, which suggests they're distasteful in some way, or potentially are like upsetting their digestive tract, like you would get with a monarch is really the classic example people think of. So it looks like they may be getting some sort of toxicity, potentially from the Tree of Heaven, potentially maybe from other things as well. We don't know for sure yet, but that's definitely something people are very, very interested in right now.
Do we know whether they provide any benefit in their native habitat?
Um, that is another very good question. I mean, I don't know for sure, but I would guess that it's kind of a similar thing as a lot of insects that you encounter in the woods that aren't directly causing issues for us or plant health or anything like that, where they're food for other things. They're playing some important part in the ecosystem. I mean, there's certainly, if there's that honeydew that's providing food for things like ants. I mean, we all know about,
Like the aphids.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So that's a benefit they might provide in their native range. So yeah, they're where they're not able to be at these constant outbreak levels. I would guess there are little bits and pieces of the ecosystem where they kind of fit right in and provide those benefits. But again, they weren't previously well studied, so I don't know of anyone who's looked at that specifically.
Speaking of the honeydew, we have a question whether you have any recommendations of how to wash it off. Is it soap, lava soap, detergent, alcohol?
Um, oh geez, I haven't had to do it much myself. The person who if it's really bad, the power washing seems to work. Like it's going to depend on the surface, I think. Soap and water seems to be okay in other situations. As with anything, I think doing a spot check if you have a delicate surface can be really important, just to make sure you're not damaging it.
So, what is the guess about what they like about grapevines that much? If they don't like the fruit, they don't like the leaves, is it about the stem?
I these, the audience has so many good questions. Or if they're from you, they're great questions too.
We're a
Um,
team. We work together.
yes, yes. Um, so I mean, it's something about the sap that they just particularly like. I again, I don't know of what it is in particular that attracts them to grapes. That's one of those questions that I think we would all very much like to know, but nobody has an answer to yet.
That is great. I have another question. When you talked about, is it slime flux that you talked
Yes.
about?
Yes.
FLUX.
Yes. Yep. Yep. So it's basically like the sap ferments. I can share some resources to read a little bit more up on that. It's not just spotted lanternfly that cause it. It can happen in other cases with trees as well. But we've just been seeing it a little bit more with spotted lanternfly.
Oh, neat. One listener says the egg masses look similar to spongy moths.
Yes. Yes. I cut it for time, but I actually, well, I could probably show it. I have a slide with them side by side. The best way to tell them apart is here it is. Okay. Um, oops. Okay, the spongy moth egg masses are more of a kind of reddish brown color, and the spotted lanternfly egg masses are more of a gray brown color. And in addition to that, okay, there we go. So you can see this top photo, we've got the spotted lanternfly egg mass and then a spongy moth egg mass. And the spotted lanternfly egg masses, we have the coating, it's more like putty, whereas the spongy moth egg mass has a bunch of little tiny hairs in it. So it's kind of a little bit fuzzy. And you can actually, you don't have to, don't worry, you don't have to actually touch them to tell that. You can usually see that bit of like fuzziness when you're just looking at them.
Fascinating. Thank you. That's really neat. We have a long question, but it's really interesting. As you
Mhm.
have shown in many of your photos, large numbers of lanternflies can be seen on the trunks of Tree of Heaven or branches of grapes. Did they remain there throughout the evening, or do they move into some sheltered location? What is the survivability of nymphs that hatch from, oh, that's separate, but let's start with part one.
Okay. They do move around an area quite a bit. I have not paid attention because luckily I don't live in a place where they're at that high number yet. I haven't looked at whether or not they're there overnight. I can ask though and let you know. There's some people I know who might have a better answer to that. They certainly, and I do want to, I didn't get into this as much, but I do want to mention with those high numbers on trees, they also tend to sort of pick individual trees that they really like that they go for year after year. And for example, you can have like a street with just maples planted all along it. And there'll be one maple year after year that's just covered in lanternfly, like in those photos, and the rest of them, like a few, but not nearly as many. And they've looked at like the tree health, how much water is it getting? Is it in the shade or is it more sunny? And so far, no one's been able to figure out why they pick some individual trees to like really, really go for.
There's so much research to be done. You need some interns, don't you?
There's so much. I have a whole list of things that I like desperately want someone out there to study. Like there are so many like master's degree projects, so many like PhD projects out there waiting there for Lanternfly. If anyone wants to do it, and I guess get funding, that's important too. But so many
Yeah.
questions.
Well, we have more questions, but our time is running out and we can't get to all of them.
Mhm.
So I have to say what Andy said to us, that was fantastic. And it really was amazing. Thank you so very much.
Thank
and
you.
everyone for being here. If you have more questions, you may submit them to Dr. Barnes through webinars@newtonconservators.org or through the connections that she provided that I will send out tomorrow. Thank you so very much, Elizabeth. This was incredible. We've got to get you back for more. And thank you, everybody. Good night.